Just 5 days after the 9/11 attacks, President Bush was already using the phrase war on terrorism. A couple days after that, he's using the phrase war on terror. So what is this war on terrorism? Well, the war on terrorism effectively ended the foreign policy lull of the 1990s and replaced it with a global struggle, one that would direct American foreign policy right up to the time of this filming. And right from the beginning, the war on terrorism was about more than just catching terrorists, finding terrorists, eliminating terrorism. It was also about finding and eliminating those who financed terrorism, finding and eliminating those who harbored terrorists. And that last one, that's a pretty broad criteria. Entire countries could be seen as harboring terrorists. So entire countries could find themselves within the crosshairs of the United States military, facing all-out attacks or out-and-out invasion and occupation. Of course, that did happen multiple times. So, in other words, the war on terrorism sort of functioned in much the same way as the old Cold War had functioned. In other words, in terms of America's foreign policy, in terms of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, the war on terrorism provided sort of an overarching global framework for the projection of American power. The difference here, of course, is that the U.S. now is the only superpower in the world and explicitly would like to keep it that way. On the evening of September 11th, 2001, President Bush addressed the American people via televised speech. And in that speech, he promised to find and punish those responsible for the 9/11 attacks, but he also promised to find and punish those responsible for harboring those who had carried out the 9/11 attacks. Now that's a critical detail, those who are harboring the terrorists. Well, in this case, the terrorist identified as having carried out the attacks was Osama bin Laden, a Saudi exile, and his organization, Al-Qaeda, the Fort. However, those identified as harboring bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, in other words, the regime ruling Afghanistan. This is a government, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So an entire country, essentially. So it's one thing to go after a guy or to go after that guy's organization. It's a very different thing to go after an entire country, an entire government. Because what that entails is post-op nation building. And indeed, the U.S. military was able to quite quickly topple the Taliban regime, but then afterward, you've got to stick around and do something with the ruins, do something with the leftovers. You've got to build a country. And what the U.S. found and has found up to the time of this filming, almost 20 years on, is that nation building in Afghanistan is virtually impossible. And maybe nation building in and of itself is virtually impossible by an outside force. In Afghanistan, certainly this has been the case. The U.S. almost immediately after toppling the regime, the Taliban regime, faced and continues to this day to face a Taliban resurgency and acts today as pretty much the security forces of a puppet regime in Afghanistan, one that the U.S. installed, albeit through elections, though not without controversy. So nation building, tricky business, very, very complicated. And of course, over the course of this entire war, the U.S.'s longest running war to date, again, as of the time of this filming, hundreds of thousands of Afghans, perhaps even 1 million, have perished. Well, the Bush administration claimed to have intelligence demonstrating that the dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction in his country, WMDs. Weapons inspectors told a different story, couldn't really find anything. But despite that, and despite the fact that there was vociferous opposition to any invasion of Iraq here at home, and there were 1 million-man marches here is crazy, I remember. And despite great opposition from allies abroad and other international opposition, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. 65,000 troops. This is about the same number that Lincoln sent south against the Confederate States of America after Fort Sumter. 65,000 troops marched towards Baghdad. Took about 3 weeks to get to Baghdad and conquer the city. 3 weeks. But then you have the same problem you had in Afghanistan. What do you do after you've effectively toppled the regime? Now you have to nation build. And it turned out that nation building in Iraq was almost more impossible, more difficult, less successful than nation building had been in Afghanistan, which is saying something. Almost immediately there was an anti-American insurgency that developed in Iraq, took countless lives. Almost immediately Al-Qaeda became a presence in Iraq. Keep in mind that before the American invasion, Al-Qaeda had virtually no presence in Iraq. But after the invasion, Al-Qaeda established a great presence. In fact, it was an Al-Qaeda offshoot, the Islamic State, that eventually controlled large parts of Iraq and neighboring countries. This is all a result of that American invasion and occupation. In fact, that American presence sort of unlocked a Pandora's box of mutual animosities and local hatreds that previously had been brutally bottled up by Saddam Hussein. Infrastructure was destroyed, educational and employment opportunities were destroyed, and at the end of the day, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, perhaps 1 million, were killed. The global war on terrorism would see the U.S. invade and occupy multiple countries, of course most famously Iraq and Afghanistan, but other countries were invaded too, other regimes were toppled, and the U.S. got involved in a costly drone war in Pakistan. Thousands of Pakistanis died in that war, and just dropped bombs on groups, among whom was a potential target. But many others could die too. That's the nature of bomb dropping. Anyway, thousands died in that Pakistani drone war. The U.S. got involved in wars in North Africa. The U.S. got involved in wars in East Africa, in the Philippines, in Syria, in Yemen, all over the place, as part of this global projection of American power. So 9/11 really does represent a major shift when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. But it wasn't just internationally, domestically as well. There were major changes, cultural changes, social changes, political changes. To name a few, the Department of Homeland Security was created, under which you'll find FEMA and the TSA. That was a new thing. The TSA always having to be searched. This seems to sort of walk the line when it comes to the Bill of Rights, or skirt the edges of legality. But in any case, you have the TSA and other legal changes like that. You have the interestingly named Patriot Act, which, among other things, seems to authorize a massive domestic spying program. And to this day, all phone calls and emails and text messages and social media posts and Google searches and all that stuff, that's all collected. So the U.S. government works, again, thanks to the Patriot Act, works in concert with communications companies, telephone companies, internet companies, and whatnot, and collects all this stuff and houses them in data centers located all over the country. And all you need is a FISA warrant. They're really rubber stamps. They pretty much never say no when it comes to requests for this information. That's what you need to be able to access phone calls and other things like that. So this makes a lot of Americans uncomfortable. Americans tend to be uncomfortable about domestic spying of any kind. It seems un-American. So, in short, the 9/11 attacks drastically changed America's foreign policy to something much more militant and aggressive on a global scale, and drastically changed things here at home, changing government and changing the role of government, changing the scope of government in the name of security, absolutely eroding civil liberties. So the U.S. government has done a few things of a questionable constitutional nature in its pursuit of terrorists and ending terrorism worldwide and whatnot. But has it worked? Is the world safer for Americans? Have terrorist organizations found it more difficult to form and expand? Has the number of terror attacks decreased dramatically or stopped? Well, unfortunately, if those are your metric, then the war on terror has not worked. In fact, it's been a dismal failure. After spending something like $3 trillion, almost $3 trillion, in pursuit of these ends, the war on terror has actually produced a drastic increase in terrorist attacks, fatalities from terrorist attacks. This is since 9/11. Not to mention fatalities among U.S. military servicemen and women. Over 7,000, that's twice the number, more than twice the number that died on 9/11, have died in these various theaters of the global war on terror. More than 50,000 of them have been injured. To say nothing of all the suicides, thousands of suicides by returned servicemen and women veterans who come home with serious mental health issues. I mean, the costs of war are great. You better be sure before you launch one. Then you got the body count worldwide, the non-American body count. Anywhere between 500,000 and 2 million dead bodies produced by the global war on terrorism. So, hard to say that that's a success. And couple that with the fact that the U.S. is still involved all over the world, over 800 military bases or other installations in over 150 countries worldwide, involved at the time of this filming in half a dozen foreign wars. If you're interested in taking a deeper dive into history, consider one of my full courses, each including something like 400 plus pages of text, 30 plus hours of audio, 50, 60, 70 on-location videos filmed all over the world, plus all the scaffolding you could ask for should you want to take it like a traditional student. We're talking guided notes, both blank and filled, quizzes, structure training, document lessons. These really are unique and one of a kind. Check them out. Also, if you want to support what I do here, consider joining Nomad Nation, where you'll gain exclusive access to monthly webinars, Q&A, a monthly newsletter called Nomad Notes, special live stream events from all over the world. I'll send you 4 postcards a year, discounts. Go check all this out at nomadicprofessor.com.